War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to a current events special edition, the National Guard and Trump versus Newsom. I thought I would try something a little different and be more timely and discuss some nuances of current events. While not a credentialed expert in the law of domestic utilization of military forces, I have more than a passing knowledge in history, having served in all three and arguably four of the various types of military service. I thought having a quick discussion of the titles, forces, authorizations, and associated restrictions would be a good idea and help with the overall objective of the podcast to develop a more informed citizenry. This will not be a strictly scripted episode and more of a free-flowing lecture, so all apologies. Likewise, I am in the midst of moving and have lost my fairly quiet office, and to make matters worse, I am battling a cold. So, I beg your pardon for what is an obvious decrease in production quality. There are two primary parts of the United States Code, otherwise known as federal law, dealing with military services. The Coast Guard will be upset at their exclusion, but get over it. There's Title 10, which covers federal service, and Title 32, which covers the National Guard. Note that Title 10 is not just full-time, but also covers the various reserves of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. Likewise, Title 32 covers the Air Guard and Army Guard and includes those full-time members of the various National Guards of the states, known as AGR, or Active Guard and Reserve. As the title implies, both the Title 10 Reserves and Title 32 National Guard have full-time members, and we will exclude, for the moment, those dual-status technicians who serve as civilian employees of the Guard and Reserve while simultaneously and mandatorily service as part-time reservists or guardsmen. This configuration dates to 1903 and the Militia Act of that same year, known colloquially as the Dick Act, after its author and primary proponent, Charles Dick, himself a member of the Ohio National Guard, eventually becoming its Adjutant General. The Adjutant General then, as now, is the commander of each state's National Guard and is, in all cases, save Washington, D.C., appointed by the governor. Previous to this, the Militia Acts of the 18th century governed the part-time forces. Constitutionally speaking, Congress is responsible for calling forth the militia. This creates some issues when Congress fails to do so, but the president wishes to utilize the militia against the wishes of the governor of the state. Originally, it was assumed by the founders that the concurrence of the governor was required in the absence of congressional approval, and even with congressional authorization, there was no clear mechanism when the governor and the state refused to hand over their state militia to the federal government. Further complicating things is defining what is the militia. This would appear to be clear-cut, as from the aforementioned Title 10, the militia is clearly defined as the militia of the United States consists of all able-bodied males at least 17 years of age and, except as provided in Sections 313 of Title 32, under 45 years of age who are or who have made declaration of intention to become citizens of the United States and of female citizens of the United States who are members of the National Guard. This expansive body is then subdivided into two groups: the organized militia, which consists of the National Guard and the Naval Militia, and the unorganized militia, which is everyone else. It is under this expansive definition that authorizes the draft of men 17 to 45 years of age. As they are members of the unorganized militia, by law, Congress is empowered to call them forth for wartime service. Likewise, National Guard units and naval militias may be called forth as units. This configuration of the organized and unorganized militia is the heart of the law behind the Dick Act. This understanding of the militia now puts into context the preamble to the Second Amendment, noting a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. So what are those threats to a free state? Well, this requires an understanding of the Bill of Rights and its origination driven by the concerns of the anti-federalists, who thought the Constitution, which emerged from the secrecy of the Second Constitutional Convention, to sum up, the Anti-Federalists, as the collection of those opposed to the Constitution as written were called, felt the federal government had too much power over the citizens and the states, and opposed ratification until guarantees were provided that the new government would not turn tyrannical, as governments seem wont to do. To alleviate these apparently legitimate concerns, the Bill of Rights was added, and specifically the aforementioned Second Amendment. So why this historical vignette? Specifically, the Second Amendment and its explicitly defined, well-regulated militia was meant to be a check on federal power, not to be an enforcement arm of the federal government. The requested regulation to be provided by the various states themselves, and it was the failure of the states to provide proper regulation or training, in more modern terms, to their militias that was found notably during the then recent Spanish-American War of 1898 that led to the Dick Act, bringing the state militias under the authority and training of the federal government, and bringing with it also federal dollars to enable that. Before getting to the point, another law must be discussed upon which much is said and little is understood, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. This law, a direct result of Reconstruction policies after the Civil War, forbids federal troops from acting as a law enforcement agency. The term Posse Comitatus is a Latin term which recognizes the right of a county sheriff to organize an ad hoc police force from the citizens of his county. So while all men are members of the militia, they are likewise assumed to be members of the police force of their county when needed. In the context of the National Guard, that means that Title 32 National Guard forces may perform law enforcement duties in the state, while Title 10 forces cannot. And when Title 32 National Guard units are brought up into federal service, they become Title 10 to reflect the status as serving as part of the reserve of the regular army, and not as members of the militia in service to the states, ultimately as a check on federal power. Which brings us to today. President Trump, within his authority as Commander-in-Chief to mobilize California's National Guard into federal service, can do so, but only in Title 10 status, which would render them incapable, legally speaking, from performing precisely those law enforcement activities they were mobilized to perform. Instead, he has ordered them to serve but remaining in Title 32 service, which would appear to be, and as Governor Newsom is arguing, illegal and unconstitutional. Without commentary to the underlying merits of the government's immigration enforcement policies, I believe Governor Newsom is right to attempt to reclaim sovereignty over his militia. If the president can assume control over the National Guard against the wishes of the governor and use them for law enforcement activities in that same state, this would violate, certainly in spirit and arguably in law, the Posse Comitatus Act. In the greater sense, if the purpose of the militia and the Second Amendment is as a check on federal government tyranny, then the ability to mobilize the National Guard as part of the militia against the wishes of the governor is likewise unconstitutional, and certainly when done so to perform law enforcement activities. Case law is certainly against Governor Newsom's and my position that the governor must maintain final authority for the mobilization of his militia. This does not mean the federal judiciary is correct. Dred Scott speaks immortally to the fallibility of our black-robed aristocracy. That being said, I do believe the president has the authority in law to use Title 10 forces to suppress what could be defined not only as an insurrection against the laws of the United States, which the protests almost certainly are, but that the primary objective is to remove foreigners here illegally, flying a foreign flag and performing violent acts on American soil. The president can and should invoke the Insurrection Act and then constitutionally use the available active duty forces or any mobilized Title 10 forces, provided the governors agree to the mobilization, to suppress the rebellion against the rule of law and to collect and expel any invaders here illegally. This would be the constitutionally proper and politically risky method to achieve that which his administration has deemed necessary to protect and defend these United States. Hope you enjoyed this quick detour into current events and American history. If you did, let me know. If you didn't, let me know. And maybe we'll have more of these sort of current events side quests going forward. Thanks a lot, and I'll still catch you on Sunday for the normal podcast. Bye. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.